August 13, 2025, in the contested waters of the South China Sea, a Chinese warship confronted the American destroyer USS Higgins in an act that was as reckless as it was arrogant. Beijing's naval captains shouted commands over the radio, boasting loudly of their supposed sovereignty, while their Coast Guard vessels relentlessly sprayed Filipino fishermen with water cannons, driving them from the waters they had long called home. The scene was humiliating, and the image of simple wooden boats fleeing from towering steel giants would remain etched in the minds of those who witnessed it. But the USS Higgins is no pushover, weighing in at 9,200 tons of steel and firepower. It was engineered for one purpose: to project dominance across any ocean with quiet authority. This was not just any naval patrol, it was a reminder that American power on the high seas still commands respect. What unfolded on this day was not just a military maneuver. It was a clash of pride, sovereignty, and raw power. So, what truly transpired in this confrontation? Were there any shots fired? Let's delve into the details and uncover the truth. August 13, 2025, 7:46 a.m., the calm surface of the South China Sea was shattered, not by the crashing of waves, but by a confrontation that would echo far beyond the waters. The USS Higgins, a 9,000-ton destroyer, was conducting a routine freedom of navigation operation near the disputed Scarborough Shoal to Washington. This was not a reckless gamble. It was a carefully calculated mission, an assertion of international law, a statement that the world's busiest sea lanes must remain open regardless of whose flag was flying nearby. But Beijing had other plans. From the haze on the horizon, several Chinese warships emerged, their sharp gray silhouettes slicing through the waves like predators closing in on their prey. The Chinese vessels Type 05 to D destroyers and Type 05 for a frigates had come to make their presence known. The edge of China's growing naval power was closing fast. Within moments, they were parallel to the Higgins, closing to within 500 yards, a dangerously close distance at sea. The radio crackled, and a voice, thick with authority and menace, demanded, "U.S. warship, you are in Chinese waters. Leave immediately or face consequences." The intent was clear. This was no standard patrol by China. It was a deliberate act of intimidation, a carefully timed provocation meant to challenge American resolve. Some of the Chinese ships even maneuvered dangerously close to the Higgins, cutting across its bow at sharp angles and creating wakes that threatened to push the American vessel off course. The message from Beijing was unmistakable: yield or be forced to. Onboard the Higgins, the tension was palpable. Sailors gripped the steel railings with white knuckles. Their orders were clear: maintain a steady course and speed, and do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Restraint was key. To those aboard, it must have felt like standing at the edge of a precipice. Every fiber of their training screamed for action: react, defend, strike, but discipline held. Not a single missile was armed. Not a single gun was elevated. To the ordinary American, it may seem unimaginable. America's mighty Navy, the most powerful force on the planet, forced to endure such blatant harassment without firing a shot. But this is the razor's edge of modern conflict. In today's world, strength is not just measured by firepower, but by control, by the ability to exercise restraint even when every instinct demands otherwise. The tension in the air was suffocating. One wrong move, one moment of panic, and the Higgins, a 155-meter-long destroyer, could have become the trigger for a global crisis. Scarborough Shoal, a few reefs and rocks barely breaking the surface of the sea, had become the backdrop for a dangerous game between superpowers. And on that morning, the world came perilously close to watching peace unravel, not from an open act of aggression, but from pride, provocation, and a single mistake. If you had been the commander of the USS Higgins, what would you have done? Would you have ordered your crew to retaliate? Would you have fired at the Chinese ships, or would you have held firm and waited for the storm to pass? The standoff dragged on, minute after minute, as if time itself was stretching thin under the weight of the moment. The Chinese ships pressed harder, edging closer and tighter, seeking to provoke a reaction. One Chinese frigate cut dangerously, close to the Higgins's bow, shrinking the distance between them to a mere 300 yards a heartbeat in naval terms. At that range, the slightest collision between two such massive vessels could cause catastrophic damage, breaching hulls, igniting fuel, and leading to the loss of hundreds of lives in a matter of minutes. The Chinese knew this. That was the point, but on board the Higgins, discipline held strong. The ship's bridge remained calm, the officers issuing steady, almost mechanical commands: hold course, maintain speed. There was no panic, no rash orders. The ship's crew was well trained for moments like this, and their resolve was uncheckable. Sailors stood at attention, gripping the rails until their hands were white from the pressure. One later described the feeling as standing in front of a loaded cannon and daring it to fire. They knew the power that was within their grasp. The Higgins was armed with 96 vertical launch cells, each capable of unleashing Tomahawk missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, or SM to surface-to-air missiles in mere seconds. In under 2 minutes, the Higgins could turn every hostile ship on radar into twisted wreckage, sending them to the bottom of the sea. But that was exactly why restraint mattered. Firing in anger could destroy more than just a few vessels. It could ignite a conflict that no one would be able to control. This was not just a naval standoff, it was a test of both strength and judgment. Would the Higgins captain fire, or would the power of restraint prevail? In a world where superpowers control the fates of over 1.7 billion people, the heavy burden of restraint sits like a weight, far heavier than the 9,200 tons of steel underfoot. Still, the provocation simmered, burning through the tense silence. Imagine being stationed aboard one of America's most advanced destroyers, Higgins, costing nearly $2 billion to construct. You're in the midst of a high-stakes confrontation, forced to endure taunts, threats, and intimidation from ships of far lesser capabilities. To the crew aboard the Higgins, every splash of water from a Chinese ship's wake, every bark demand over the radio was an insult not only to their mission, but to their flag. The frustration was tangible, it sat in their chests like a heavy stone. Yet, despite all of it, this restraint was not weakness, it was a silent, unyielding power. Higgins' Spy 1D radar tracked over 200 targets simultaneously, marking the presence of every Chinese ship, fishing vessel, and aircraft overhead. The sailors knew that at any given moment, they had the capability to strike first, strike hard, and strike decisively. The Chinese wanted to assert dominance, but in doing so, they revealed something far more revealing: desperation. That morning, the restraint shown by the Higgins crew was not a sign of vulnerability, but a testament to their discipline. It proved that America's true strength lies not just in its arsenal, but in its ability to exercise control. However, deep within every sailor aboard the Higgins was a shared understanding: patience has its limits. When those limits are crossed, the consequences can send shockwaves through the world. Behind every silent command and clenched fist lay the true measure of American power. Power that was not just endured, but waiting to be unleashed. While Chinese destroyers and frigates prowled menacingly in close proximity, the USS Higgins cut through the waves with composed precision. To an observer, the ship might have appeared passive, cornered even, but beneath its steel decks lay an arsenal capable of altering the course of nations in mere hours. Higgins' vertical launch system alone housed 96 missile tubes. Each tube could be armed with an SM to interceptor, an ESSM for close defense, or a Tomahawk cruise missile with a reach exceeding 1,000 miles. This single destroyer packed more firepower than the entire Philippine Navy combined. The ship's phalanx CIWS could unleash 45,500 rounds per minute, a steel curtain that would obliterate any missile or aircraft daring to approach. And with its SPY-1D radar, it could track over 200 targets at once, sifting through real threats and false signals with precise accuracy. For Beijing's commanders, these capabilities were not lost on them. The Chinese flotilla comprised of Type 05-D destroyers armed with YJ-18 anti-ship missiles, capable of supersonic speeds and striking a carrier from nearly 290 miles away, bristled with weaponry. The accompanying Type 05 for a frigates added even more missile tubes to the mix, creating an image of strength through numbers. But the reality was much less assured. Even with their impressive array of weapons, the Chinese ships were fully aware that they were shadowing a vessel linked into the most sophisticated command and control system on Earth, the US Navy's Aegis network. Every move they made, every radar signal they emitted, was tracked not only by Higgins, but also by satellites above and submarines lurking below. In any real conflict, the Chinese captains knew their ships would be reduced to smoldering wrecks in under 15 minutes, and yet, despite this grim truth, they pressed on. They weren't after military dominance, they were engaging in psychological theater. Their goal was to send a message: they would not yield. For the men aboard the Higgins, this reality was bitter. They knew they held the power to neutralize the threat in seconds, but their orders were clear: endure, hold the course, let the world bear witness to who truly held authority without firing a single shot. That morning, Scarborough Shoal was not just a reef. It became a stage where America's unmatched power was measured, not by missiles and guns, but by the restraint shown by those who could annihilate their enemies but chose not to. The US destroyer stood tall not in aggression, but in discipline and strength. But while this high-stakes drama unfolded at sea, another, more heartbreaking story was taking place at the edges of Scarborough Shoal. Over 40 Filipino fishing boats, relying on the reefs for their livelihoods, struggled to haul in their morning catch. For these fishermen, the reefs were not a battleground, they were a source of life, sustaining families for generations. But that morning, they found themselves caught between the Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels. The smaller Chinese ships, though not as imposing as the warships shadowing Higgins, were equally as aggressive. They swarmed in on the fishing boats, sirens blaring and water cannons firing torrents of pressurized water strong enough to smash windows and tear nets from the boats' wooden frames. Some of the Filipino boats, no longer than 50 feet and weighing barely 20 tons, were rammed and nearly capsized by the weight of Chinese steel. The fishermen, who once found peace in these waters, were now living a cruel nightmare. Their livelihoods were being torn apart, not by nature, but by the wrath of a powerful neighbor bent on domination. The contrast between these two scenes couldn't have been more stark. On one side, the calm restraint of America's might standing firm, measured, and prepared to strike when the time was right. On the other, the helplessness of those caught in the midst of a power struggle that had nothing to do with them, but would forever alter their lives. The hulls of massive vessels displaced 2,000 tons of water as they surged through the waves, their sheer size and power creating a stark imbalance. A family's humble wooden boat, built for subsistence fishing, now faced machines designed to intimidate and dominate. Yet, the abuse didn't stop there. Radios crackled with shouted insults. Filipino fishermen labeled as trespassers, their livelihoods reduced to little more than an inconvenience. One fisherman, fighting back tears, described the ordeal: "They chased us like we were vermin, something to be eradicated from the sea." For men who had spent their lives working these waters, the humiliation of being treated like pests was far worse than any physical injury. By noon, at least a dozen Filipino boats had been forced back, their nets torn apart and their hard-earned catch destroyed. This wasn't just an economic blow, it was a catastrophe for coastal communities that relied on the sea for their survival. What was lost in those hours meant not only hunger, but financial ruin. A lifetime's worth of work could be wiped out in a single morning. In 2016, international law had already declared that these waters were part of the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. But China's actions spoke volumes about the true power dynamic. On paper, legal rulings meant little when real-world power was wielded through steel ships and water cannons. From the deck of the USS Higgins, American sailors watched the scene unfold. They could see the flashes of water spray in the distance, the smaller Filipino boats scattering as they were forced to retreat before the larger, menacing Chinese vessels. Yet, there was nothing they could do. Their mission was one of restraint. But the silence of their position only heightened the tragedy of what they witnessed. A superpower's warship enduring harassment while its allies' fishermen were treated like pests. This was a picture the world was never meant to see, but it revealed a sobering truth. China's hunger for control had no mercy, not even for unarmed civilians. Scarborough Shoal, a small and barely visible ring of reefs and rocks, had transformed from an insignificant speck on the map into one of the most volatile flashpoints in the world. The reason for its significance is simple: whoever controls these waters controls a critical artery of global trade. Every year, more than $3.5 trillion worth of goods passes through the South China Sea. That's nearly a third of the world's maritime commerce, carried by more than 60,000 merchant vessels. The stakes are even higher for the energy supply. Oil tankers alone transport over 15 million barrels of crude every day, fueling the economies of Japan, South Korea, and the United States itself. If China is allowed to solidify its dominance over this region, the consequences would be staggering. Imagine a China with the ability to delay, divert, or even cut off shipments in one of the busiest trade routes on Earth. This is not merely about fishing rights or maritime boundaries. It's about the power to disrupt entire global economies, to use economic warfare without firing a single shot. For the United States, the stakes couldn't be clearer. The credibility of its alliances is at risk if the Philippines, a long-time treaty ally, is left to endure harassment from Chinese ships alone. Then what faith can Japan or South Korea have in Washington's word? Every incident, every provocation becomes a propaganda victory for Beijing, eroding global confidence in American resolve. And yet, the USS Higgins patrol proved another important truth. America is still there, still present, still committed to defending the principle that no nation owns the world's sea lanes. Scarborough Shoal is no longer about just a few reefs. It's become the site of a contest between two futures, one where international law governs, and one where brute force rules the day. In this contest, every close call, every confrontation is more than just a skirmish. It is a test of America's role as the guarantor of peace on the high seas. The encounter at Scarborough Shoal ended without a single missile fired or a shot heard. But in many ways, that silence was louder than any battle cry. For hours, the sailors aboard the Higgins stood firm, enduring reckless provocation, watching as Chinese destroyers pressed closer, listening to the insults crackling through the radio, and seeing Filipino fishermen scattered like prey before the steel prows of militia ships. They didn't respond in kind. They held their position with a steadfast discipline that cut deeper than any direct retaliation could. This is the paradox of modern power. The United States commands the most advanced navy in the world, a fleet capable of obliterating enemies with the flick of a switch. Yet in this era, victory is not measured by the sound of missiles, but by patience, restraint, and the ability to uphold law when it's mocked. It's about standing firm when allies are harassed and showing the world that true strength is more than just the power to destroy. It's the ability to protect what is right, even when the world seems